All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. There are not enough copies for everybody, but a perfect opportunity to learn proper manners and and share accordingly. So we're discussing the way to attain a proper outlook in life, and we had discussed over the last couple of weeks the basic methodology is that when one studies Torah with the outlook of having Torah be able to be not only a guidebook of just how to check a number of things off of a list and do a number of mitzvot, but actually as a general guide to life of how to carry yourself. And the more that you delve into the depths of the Torah, into garner an understanding as to the structure of the Torah, what this mitzvah is trying to teach me, etc., one gains a whole life's outlook on how to carry themselves, even in areas that are obviously not even discussed directly in the Torah. For example, things like a pandemic, social justice issues, etc., just how to be a mensch. Those are not things that are directly explicit in the Torah, but the more that one studies Torah, the more that one develops a proper outlook to life. In all cultures, in all societies, this is something that we've strived to do in human history. In every society, in every era of history, we have all attempted to find the key to life, the key to a successful and meaningful life. That's, in fact, Rav Volbe Zatzal, Rav Shlomo Volbe, was the spiritual guide of Yeshivas Be'er Yaakov in Jerusalem, passed away in 2005. He did not grow up religious. It's fascinating. He, at the age of 17 years old, he's a very, very bright boy. At the age of 17 years old, went to go study in university in Germany. It wasn't in Berlin. I forget which university. He went to go study in university, and when he was in university, he part of the core curriculum was he needed to take philosophy 101, and he's sitting in philosophy class. Again, he did not grow up religious. He grew up with a strong Jewish identity, but not religious by any stretch of the imagination. And he was living in Germany, yeah. And he's sitting in class, and they're discussing Aristotle, and they're discussing, all of these different theologians and philosophers and ideas and Plato, and he says to himself, he says that he keeps finding holes in the different presentations that are being made, and he says, you know what? Why don't I look at what the Torah has to say? And he went, and so the starting place for him was, again, this curiosity of trying to discover truth in the world, trying to find a proper outlook in life. And he fell to where his roots were, which was the Torah. He became a Torah observant individual and became really one of the leaders of the Jewish people. In fact, he is responsible for much of the what would be called the Baal Tshuva movement, even though I don't like that term, of people finding themselves religiously. Most of the modern day Kiruv is based on Rav Volbe's work. It's an amazing thing. So he writes in the introduction to his work, Alei Shor, he says that this has been something that people do throughout history. Everyone's walking around looking for God, looking for meaning. And he said that there's one place in the world. They walked around in Greece, they walked around in Athens, they walked around in Rome asking this question, where is God? Where is meaning? There's one place they walk around not asking this question. That's Yerushalayim. That's Jerusalem. That's what he writes. That's how he opens up his work. Because that's our Torah. Our Torah provides all of this for us. We just have to open it up, learn it, delve into it, discover it, but it's all there. So I want to tonight look at the flip side of, well, maybe we should start with philosophy. I mean, there are philosophers and amazing literature that's available, and a lot of it is quite intriguing. And yes, Rav Volbe started with philosophy and ended up discovering Torah. And is there a problem studying philosophy? Or maybe I should. I want to be worldly. I want to be understand. What's the problem with studying? Is there a problem with studying philosophy? Is it a good thing to study philosophy? We've discussed many times already that the Rambam himself studied philosophy, and he didn't just study philosophy. He said that it is the most enjoyable of all the learning that he does is the study of philosophy. The most enjoyable of all the learning he does. In fact, he writes at the end of his introduction to his commentary on the Mishnah of Masechet Brachot, which he wrote at the age of 31 years old. The Rambam wrote it as a Arabic art scroll. There was no art scroll at the time, but he wrote it for the layperson in the Arab-speaking countries to translate the Mishnah and give explanation to the Mishnah from the Talmud, and also be able to give the bottom line halacha of how to practice. And he writes at the very last word he has over there in his commentary on the tractate of Brachot. He says that even though the topic of faith and philosophy is loosely connected to what we were just discussing, nevertheless, I want to use the opportunity, because whenever I have the opportunity to discuss these topics, I want to jump on the opportunity because it's the most enjoyable and most important to discuss these topics. So we have the Rambam, who seems to be encouraging the study of philosophy, and yet we know that if we just study the Torah, we can get an outlook on life. Is there something to be said about studying philosophy and studying secular philosophy? Okay, so let's begin. So the first source we're going to look at is from the Rashba. The Rashba, Rabbeinu Shlomo ben Aderet, lived 1240 to 1310. The Rashba was the one of the chief rabbis in Spain. He was the chief rabbi of Toledo. He really was. He was the Spanish Rishon, early commentator from the 13th century, that really opened up the study of the Talmud for a study in and of itself for that time period. He was a student of the Ramban and Nachmanides, who died in 1270. He was buried in Israel. He was a student of Nachmanides. He had a number of students of his own. Probably most famously was the Ritva. But the Rashba was amazing. He was a leader of that period in the Spanish-speaking countries in Europe. The Rashba he didn't only write his commentary on the Talmud, but he also had a number of responsa, and not just the number of responsa. He had more than 1,000 different responsa on Jewish law that are most of which were trailblazers in whatever the topic they were that he was discussing. One of the topics that is discussed by the Rashba in his responsa in entry number 415, Taf Tet Vav, is the siman that discusses this. He discusses the study of philosophy, but he said, but it comes from a little bit of history. I have to talk a little bit of history here. The history was like this: that in the year 5065, which was 720 years ago, about 715, 20 years ago, there was a group of about 40 different rabbis in Spain that conferred in Barcelona to discuss the threat to Judaism of the time, which was the study of these topics. It was becoming popularized in the Spanish countries, and there was a grave concern that if we are going to let our kinderlach, our beautiful children, study these topics, so then it is going to distract them from studying Torah and getting a Torah outlook on life, that we need to do something about it. And they made a decision that they were going to prohibit the study of philosophy in their communities. And this is his essay, where he describes why and how they came to that decision. So take a look on page number 2. He writes as follows. Line number 9 on page 2. Just page 1 is the cover page of the response of the Rashba. On page number 2, he writes, line 9, the amanu vikirasnu, that we have stood up and we have made a covenant. Karasnu bris elokim, we've made a God-bound covenant. V'toras Hashem asher kibalnu anu va'avosenu b'Sinai, based on all of the Torah that we have received and our forefathers received from Mount Sinai. Line 10, lebal ya'arev zar b'tochenu, in order so that there is not going to be a stranger that gets mixed up among us. right? It's a threat of assimilation. It's a grave assimilation threat. So take a look, line number 12. V'gazarnu v'kibalnu aleinu. We've made a decree that we should accept upon ourselves. V'al zarinu, and on our children. V'al nivalim aleinu, on everyone that comes from us. B'koach hacherem, to completely outlaw libal yimod ish v'bnei kilenu b'sifrei hayavanim, lest anyone from our community study any of the books of Greek philosophy. Amazing. Asher chibro v'chachmos hateva, that were written and comprised based off of the knowledge of thinking. It's not based on any divine text. It's based on logic alone. Is a very scary thing. Imagine all of philosophy is based on human capability. It's all based on human capability. It's all based on the finite mind. None of it is from a divine source by definition. And that's a problem, he says. Halokus bein hamechubarim beloshonim. And that is the type of language that they use, is they're coming from an authoritative source, even though it is just based on their own simple logic. Skipping to the next line, line 15, by the underline, mehayom va'ad chamishim shana. From today, for the next 50 years, so it's a 50-year long outlaw, a cherem for 50 years, ad hayoso ben chamesh ve'esrim shana. It would be prohibited for anyone to study these topics if they are not at the minimum of 25 years old, is what they felt. So for the next 50 years, if you're not 25 years old, you can't study philosophy. No one from our people should be studying these topics until you are 25 years old. By that point, you've reached a certain level of maturity, of understanding that you are not going to get sideswiped by these topics. Lest these great thinkers are going to come in behind us, to remove us from our holy Torah, which is much greater than any philosophy that could be espoused by any quote unquote great thinker. And they were great thinkers. They're tremendous minds, a lot smarter than me. But nevertheless, there's a difference between divine philosophy versus human philosophy. At the end of line, at the end of the page, at the end of page 2, by the underline, that we have come out with this gzera to exclude from this cherem, from this outlaw, meaning this outlaw includes philosophy, theology, all of these studies that are based simply on logic. We have removed from this cherem, from this outlaw, chachmos harefuos, anything related to medicine. Anything related to medicine is not going to be included. Now, this was before Freud, right? This is before Freud. I'm curious. That's an interesting question. Obviously, medicine, even then, a lot of medicine was not necessarily based on fact. It couldn't necessarily be proven, right? At all, right? But nevertheless, they knew enough to be dangerous. And so that it's interesting, the reason he gives why medicine was not included. We'll get to why. But I'm curious what he would say about psychology, right? I'm curious. I mean, we don't have a way of knowing, but I'm curious because psychology, more so than any other medicine, which today there are, of course, a number of things we can say are fact with regard to medicine. But psychology, even though there have been major developments since Sigmund Freud, but nevertheless, it still is based on human thought and logic. It's not necessarily based on anything you can call hard fact.
It's worse than that. Everybody knows that virtually all their studies are not reproducible.
Right. So anyway, so it's just an interesting question that if God willing, by Tchias HaMesim, during the resurrection, we'll ask the Rashba when he comes back. Okay. And then he says, but listen to this, is amazing. Why is it that medicine is okay? Why are we not going to say medicine also at that time was based simply on huge human logic? Why don't we say that medicine should be included? He says, no, because of saving a life. But he says, interesting, he says, even though it's based on logic, because the Torah gives permission for doctors to provide medicine. So he gives a little bit of a different answer, Brian. That's the answer I would have thought. That's what I was thinking. But it's based on his same line of reasoning. What's his line of reasoning? That we don't have the right to go beyond the Torah. When it comes to philosophy, we have to stay within the boundaries of the Torah. When it comes to everything, we have to stay within the boundaries of the Torah. Why is it then that we can go to a doctor? Because the Torah says, when you're sick, you go to the doctor. Because of the fact that the Torah gives explicit permission to go see a doctor when you're sick, therefore, we can't say that medicine is a problem. God already decided that, yes, there is going to be an area of thinking that is going to be dependent primarily on human thought and logic, and I'm going to allow it. So it's interesting. I would have said the same thing if not for the fact that Rashba is just keeping in line with his reasoning. His reasoning is we don't step outside the boundaries of the Torah. Whatever the Torah demands of us, commands of us, recommends, that is what we stick to. We don't go beyond that. We don't use our own logic to figure out the true meaning of life and how to live a successful and meaningful life, etc. Very, very interesting. So he just ends off, Umashi Iskamnu, the Charmenu, that we have collectively agreed and made into law, the Sefer HaTorah, through the Torah, B'mamad, Kol HaKahal, in front of the entire Kehila, in front of the entire community, B'yom Shabbos, on Shabbos day. So this was Shabbos morning, Parshas Eila Dvarim. This was in the summer by Parshas Dvarim, that they stood up Shabbos morning and they made this decree, Shna Shishim v'chamesh leprata elef hachamishi, in the year 5065. Fascinating. There's a whole list of all the rabbis that signed off on this. There were, I counted 37 rabbis in Barcelona that signed off on this decree that to completely outlaw the study of philosophy unless you are 25 years of age for 50 years. So this lasted until the year 5,100 and 105 or whatever it was. That's how long.
Why did they decide for 50 years and not forever?
It could be that maybe they felt that it was just going to be an experiment. Yeah, I'm not sure. It is interesting also. There were other charamim. This concept of a cherem, of outlawing something, that the rabbis can come to a consensus that they want to outlaw something. They don't have the right to create new rabbinic law that is ongoing forever. That stopped once the Sanhedrin closed. Once the Sanhedrin that sat in the chambers of the temple closed down, so then no longer do we have the right to make new gezeros, make new decrees that are everlasting for the Jewish people. So there had to have been some end point in place. For example, going back to the year 1000, Rabbeinu Gershom, right? We had a series on Rabbeinu Gershom, also set out a whole number of different things that he made a decree on that lasted for 100 years. Some of them lasted for less than 100 years. For whatever reason, they felt that's all the time it needed. I wonder if they felt that it was just a popular thing that was going to phase out the study of philosophy. Maybe the threat they felt was not so long term. But
so did they see it as it was an empire religious thing?
So he doesn't say that the whatever is being espoused, whatever the philosophers are espousing, is against the Torah. I think his concern is rather that people are going to be, a lot of it is against the Torah, but people are going to be looking at that as their source of wisdom and guidance versus the Torah, which is just a major step into, assimilation and intermarriage. And as soon as you don't bind yourself to what it says in the Torah or what Torah outlook is, so then it's a slippery slope from there. So that's what he speaks about here. It could be that he was also concerned about the direct issues with the philosophies that were being presented. Okay.
Key phrase though is that after the age of 25, then it's fine.
Yeah, because by then, hopefully, you already have a foundation of Torah education. You already have a certain amount of maturity that you're not going to be waiving at that point. It is interesting. We're going to see a revush later that says a little bit differently, but there's still a lot to see. Okay, page 4.
So in the modern day, you have so many great rabbis that did study from Rabbi Sachs.
Sure. Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik had a PhD in philosophy from the University of Berlin, right? Right. Rabbi Sachs. Sure. The Lubavitcher Rebbe. That many great gedolim. I mean, it's funny sometimes when a lot of them have studied all of this stuff.
Yeah.
But isn't the Torah itself philosophical?
It is, exactly.
Well, the Torah itself is philosophical, but it's of divine nature. Yes, it is, and there's nothing wrong with studying the Torah philosophy. In fact, that we're encouraged to do so. But if we're going to study philosophy that is not based primarily on what God is intended, based on directives from God, versus based on just what we think is correct or incorrect, so then that's a very dangerous game to play. And it could be very dangerous. It could be very safe. But nevertheless, that was I think the concern that the Rashba and the rabbis of that time had. So let's see Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, 1874, until he was killed tragically in 1941 on Yud Aleph Iyar, Rahman al-Itzlan. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman was round up on the 11th of Tammuz. On the 11th of Tammuz in 1941, he was rounded up with a group of 500 of his fellow brothers and sisters, and they were murdered at the hands of the Nazis, all in one fell swoop in one night on either the 11th or 12th of Tammuz. We're not sure exactly when it happened, but horrific. In fact, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, I guess there were people there that survived, and they gave testimony of how Rabbi Chanan took a leadership role at that moment. That at that moment they were all round up. He got himself together and he started to say to the crowd of Jews that he was with that, you know, he gave an amazing speech, a motivational speech right at that moment, how to prepare yourselves for the moment that you're about to experience. And he said that when a high priest, when a Kohen brings a sacrifice on behalf of the community, so there's a prohibition in the Torah called pigul, which is that the Kohen had an ill intention when bringing the sacrifice. If a Kohen has an ill intention of bringing the sacrifice is a wasted sacrifice. He says that we have to view ourselves right now as a sacrifice for the community. We are being brought up straight to God right now, and therefore it's upon ourselves, just like the Kohen, to clear our minds from all bad intention, that we should have clear intention. Forgive anyone that may have harmed you. That you should, like, it's mind-blowing. And it was all recorded in Yiddish, and then his son translated it into Hebrew. His son, Rav Simcha Wasserman, you may have heard of. Rav Simcha Wasserman was one of the founders of the LA community, of the Los Angeles community. So, in fact, the original, that's right, the original charter of Hebrew Day School has Rav Simcha Wasserman's signature on it. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman was an unbelievable personality. There's a lot to say about him. He was Rosh Yeshiva, Baranovich Yeshiva. And Baranovich Yeshiva was basically like a yeshiva high school for students that would then go on to study in the major yeshivas. So they would first study in Baranovich, some of them would first study in Baranovich, but then from Baranovich, they'd go on to study in yeshivas like Mir, Panovich, Slobodka. He studied in Baranovich, so he must have been a very young man at the time. Yeah, so and then he went to Mir. Yeah, so that was the system. That And the Yismicha was from Mir. So that was the system. First you went to Baranovich, and then you go to the Mir, Panovich, Slabotka, etc. So Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, he had all these high schoolers. So not much has changed. High schoolers ask a lot of questions. So they were asking a lot of questions, and a lot of questions based on becoming a mature Torah scholar, where you're thinking and you want to try and understand how the Torah works, what structure is like, trying to understand the divine nature of rabbinic law, right? Rabbinic law is from the rabbis, and yet we have to follow it just the same way we do Torah law. It's a bit puzzling when you just start thinking about it. So he wrote a book called the Kuntres Devrei Sofrim, which was a little essay, not so little, it's about 150-page essay about rabbinic law and some of these broader topics of Jewish philosophy and the like, that he wrote as kind of a guidebook for his students. It's an amazing treasure that we have in Klal Yisrael, that we still have, the Kuntres Devrei Sofrim. So there's an essay over there in the Kuntres Devrei Sofrim in chapter 47 of the book, of this pamphlet. He discusses the study of secular philosophy. And is there an issue with it? It's fascinating, his approach to it. He writes over here, page number 4, the top left side of the page, by the arrow, Tshuva lish'ol Medina Yedua, that this is an answer to a well-known question. Sheila, what is the question? In mutter lehis asek bechachmos chitzonios. Is one allowed to study secular wisdom? Ube'eza ofem yiskayim hayeter hazeh. And under what parameters would it be okay to do so? And he says, Teshuva, the answer is, Hasheila hazos nechachal k'kama. There are a number of different sub topics we need to discuss in order to appreciate it. But let's get to the bottom line answer. Line number 1 on page 4. Nira, Medivrei Akadmonim, that what's come out is when you look at all of the early commentators and codifiers of Jewish law and thought, so shenechaku imuter lis asok b'philosophy, that it's unclear, not unclear. There are different opinions on the matter whether or not one is allowed to study philosophy. Remember, we said the Rambam is seems to be encouraging the study of philosophy versus the Rashba, who actually outlawed the study of philosophy for his generation. So there seems to be different opinions on the matter. And he says in line number 3, U'medivrei chovas halavavos, and from the chovas halavavos, written by a 13th century Torah philosopher, Ibn Bakua, he says in his Behakdamaso, in his introduction, Nirashi mitzvah, that it would seem to be a mitzvah to study philosophy. It's amazing. It's a mitzvah to study philosophy. Da es elokei avicha, the mitzvah of knowing God. That's the study of philosophy, is the pursuit of knowing God. That in order to have proper belief in God, you need to study philosophy so you can have a better appreciation, to try and understand, to have a knowledge of God. But then he says 2 lines later, line number 7, aval lemaisa etzleinu. However, for us in our generation, he would give caution to the study of philosophy. Ein shum nafkamina machlokesu. In fact, he goes to the point to say that there are not even different opinions on the matter. Meaning, according to Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, the Rambam, the Chovos HaLevavos, who seem to encourage the study of philosophy, they were speaking for their generation. The Rashba, already in his time, who lived after those great scholars, already saw it being an issue. Says Rabbi Chanan, 600 years later, by us, in the early 20th century, not even a question that all of them would agree that one should refrain from the study of secular philosophy. Even to those that said that it's encouraged to study philosophy, he says, that the permission to do so, or the mitzvah to do so, would only apply if it's not a threat to do so. If it's threatening to study philosophy, if it could damage a person, if it could damage a person spiritually, for sure, there's no way that any of them would allow the study of philosophy. In fact, he quotes the Rambam, who says that exact thing, that one needs to be careful when studying any ideas that are against Torah, because it's going to stray them from them. Using that same line of reasoning, Rabbi Hanan is saying, so if you're going to study philosophy that could lead to straying a person away from the Torah, so then he would give great caution to it. He says, look at line number 12. He says, Shekol harucho sheba'olam, that with regard to the Rambam, all of the winds of the world, lo yaziza mimakomam, that the Rambam, if the wind was blowing 150 miles in every single direction, nothing would shake his faith. Nothing. You have the greatest philosopher in the world that gets up and espouses how I don't know, atheism is true and correct, and he proves it with every proof under the sun, and he speaks in such a way that everybody is convinced sitting there. The Rambam would be the only person not convinced, but everybody else would be. So for the Rambam, there's no problem to sit there. That's what he's suggesting. Yes, for the Rambam, to try and understand God, it makes sense why he studied philosophy. But for the average person in our day, but people that are simpletons like us, it's a very, very dangerous thing. You're playing with fire. Asher sakana atsuma lintos uletaos. It can lead to tremendous mistakes. So this is the opinion of Rabbi Hanan Wasser, and in fact, the Nod Yehuda Rabbi Yecheskel Landau felt that this actually comes from a Gemara in Maseches Brachos. Rabbi Yecheskel Landau lived many years before Rabbi Hanan, but he also gives a very similar approach. In his book Tzion L'Nefesh Chaya, it's a commentary on Masechet Brachot, a number of different Masechtas, named after his mother. His mother's name was Chaya, and he named a book in his mother's memory. The Nod Yehuda lived from 17 until towards the end of the 18th century, and he noticed that the Talmud already speaks to this issue, and the Talmud tells a story. The story is like this: the bottom of page 4. By the underlines, the Talmud tells a story. The Rabbi Lazar fell ill. He was on his deathbed. His students came to visit him. Amrlo Rabbeinu, they said, our teacher, our master, Lamanu Orchas Chaim, give us some life lessons before you pass away. And he says to them, and there, through your life lessons, we'll be able to attain al olam haba, the world to come. They're asking for some last minute advice from their teacher of how to use the most of their time on this world. And he says, Amar lahem, he says to them the following advice. Hizarnu b'chvod chavrechem. The first thing he says is, make sure to treat each other with respect. As that's the first thing you say, right? That this is the key to getting into the world to come, of living a successful, meaningful life. Just be respectful and kind to one another. That's number one. Number two, he says, Um'anu b'nechem min higayon, and you should stay away from quote unquote higayon. What's higayon? Higayon is some sort of a study. We don't know exactly what it is. So Rashi says higayon is actually the study of certain parts of Tanakh, of the Bible, that are very difficult to understand. He's probably referring to Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, where even the Talmud already says that it almost was not included, it almost was not canonized in the Bible, because there are many things about it that are very difficult to understand on a philosophical level that seem to be against Torah philosophy. So that is perhaps what Rashi is referring to. Then Rashi gives another interpretation. Perhaps what higayon means is a childish understanding of the Bible. Don't study the Bible the way that a child would study the Bible. You have to learn like an adult. You have to ask questions. You have to be a little bit cynical about it. You have to try and get to the depths of it. Don't just take it at its surface level. Okay. The Nod Yehuda says that he thinks higayon actually means philosophy, logic. Be careful. This is what Rabbi Lazar is saying. Be careful studying logic. Be careful, because if it's going to waver you from your faith, so then that could be a very, very dangerous thing. So this is what the Nod Behuda assumes as well. His essay is on page number 5. We're going to refrain from reading it inside right now, just in the interest of time. I want to close with the Rivash. The Rivash, page number 6. You see his cover page to his responsa. The Rivash was, we would call, a later Rishon. The time of when the early commentators versus the Achronim, which were later commentators, basically split at the publication of the Shulchan Aruch. The publication of the Shulchan Aruch, where we codified all of Jewish law, really was kind of a dividing line in terms of everyone that came before the Shulchan Aruch was really giving over their halachic decisions, their guidance, based on their own way of understanding the Talmud. Everyone after the Shulchan Aruch did not have the shoulders to be able to give over a piece of guidance or halachic or halachic guidance simply based on looking at the Talmud. We needed to rely on the early commentators, and the Shulchan Aruch is the one that guided us as to how to define what is the proper way to act, what is the appropriate customs of Jewish law, etc. The Rivash died in 1408. The Shulchan Aruch was published in the beginning of the 16th century. So this is pretty much toward the end of this era. It was one of the last of the Sephardic Rishonim. So the Rivash has is one of the chapters in his book on responsa in chapter 45. He discusses the Rambam. Based on everything that we just said, we need to rationalize why is it then that the Rambam studied philosophy and encouraged philosophy. And as we mentioned before, many great Jewish thinkers have. Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik, many Rosh Yeshiva have studied these works. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman felt that it wasn't for anyone in our generation. In fact, this was a point of tension for Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman came to do a fundraising trip in New York. It was in the 30s. He came to New York. He stayed at the East Broadway Hotel, and he had a whole speaking circuit. He went to the different yeshivas in New York. The one yeshiva he would not go to was Yeshiva University. He would not go to Yeshiva University because at the time it was Dr. Revel at the time was still the president and Rosh Yeshiva of the university till he died in 1940, and then Rabbi Dr. Samuel Belkin took over as the second president of the university and the yeshiva. Philosophy was in the curriculum, and therefore he would not speak in the university. Would not. They tried to pull every single move possible to get him to speak in the university. He would not speak in the university, even though Reb Shimon Shkup Zatzal, the greatest of all of the Rosh Yeshiva in Europe, who passed away in 1929, was the last couple of years of his life a Rosh Yeshiva, was one of the heads of Yeshiva University. Still would not speak in Yeshiva University because they studied philosophy there. So Rabbi Chanan Wasserman had his approach that he felt that absolutely under no conditions can anyone today study philosophy. The Rambam, on the other hand, seems to have, he encouraged it, right? The Rashba outlawed it. So how do we understand the Rambam then? That he was able to study philosophy, encouraged the study of philosophy, etc. So here comes the Rivash, who is the saving grace for all of the great scholars, for all of the great Torah scholars that have spent their time and energy in the study of philosophy. Line number 1 on page 7. The Ein Lehevi Raya Meharambam. First, the whole first part of his essay is in agreement with the Nod Behuda, Rabbi Cheskel Landau, in agreement with the Rashba. He felt as though one needs to be extremely careful. He cautioned that it's very dangerous to study philosophy. But then he says, now don't tell me, what do you mean? Of course one should study philosophy. The Rambam studied philosophy. Ein lehevi raya meharambam zaf. Don't bring me a proof that one should study philosophy from the Rambam. Why? Continues in line number 1. Kehu lamad kodem lachem. Because first the Rambam, before studying philosophy, what did he do? He studied Kol HaTorah Kula B'Shleimut. First, he studied the entire Torah in its complete. He studied all of it first. What does he mean? He studied halachot, all of Torah law, the agadot, all of the stories of the rabbis, meaning all of the theological guidance of the rabbis. Tosefta, Sifra, Sifrei, V'chule, Talmuda, Bavli, V'Yerushalmi, all of the Talmud, all of it, all rabbinic teaching. First, he studied and mastered. Kemoshanir Mesefer Mishneh Torah Shechiba. How do I know that the Rambam did that? Because he wrote the Mishneh Torah. The Mishneh Torah is the magnum opus of the Rambam. 15-volume work, 14 volumes of the book, and then one volume is an introduction to the work of the 613 mitzvos and all of the details contained within them. All of it codified, organized, clear, concise. I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible. The mastery of Torah that's contained by the Rambam is just unbelievable. That's why it's written on the Rambam's tombstone. It's a play on his own words. The Rambam himself says in the 13 Principles of Faith that we believe that there is no greater prophet to ever live like Moshe. There never was and never will be a greater prophet than Moshe. So he writes, Lo kam kemoshe od. There's never going to be anyone as great as Moshe. So they wrote him they wrote his tombstone. They wrote on it a play on words. They said, "Lo kam kemoshe." There's not going to be anyone as great as Moshe. Ad Moshe, until Moses ben Maimon, until the Rambam. The Rambam was the greatest of. Probably. And if you were to rank him, it'd probably be Moshe Rabbeinu, Rabbi Akiva, Rambam. It's like so. The Rambam mastered it all before he studied. Before he spent his time on philosophy. Now, why is it the Rambam studied philosophy, says the Rivash? What was his whole modus operandi? So it's no secret. He even writes in the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, his work on philosophy, why it is he's writing it. It's a response. He's writing it as a response to Aristotelian thinking and all of the other it's a response. He didn't study it just for fun, or just to try and understand their way of thinking. He studied it in order so that he can respond to it. Asa Sefer HaMoreh. That's the whole reason why he wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, which is why there are even things in the Moreh Nevuchim which Jewish law does not 100% agree with, which led to a lot of controversy. There were burnings of the Rambam's books that really lasted until like the year 1280, I think. Like it went on a long time. About 80 years after the Rambam already died, they were still burning books of the Rambam because there were parts in the Moreh Nevuchim that seemed to be a little bit off kilter from a pure approach to Torah philosophy. But part of why he was writing it a little bit off was in order so that he can speak to his audience. His audience was not Torah observant Jews. His audience were people that were questioning their faith and were rather attaching themselves to Greek philosophy. So that's what he writes over the air. And he writes in line number 5, "L'stor hamoftim v'harayos," in order to be able to contradict the wondrous proofs shehevi philosophers that the philosophers brought l'kaim kadmus ha'olam, in order to explain how where the creation of the world came from, etc. V'chein beinin ha'ashgacha, and so too with the way that the world works. Ulefi shahayu b'zmanu harbe miYisrael nevochim b'ikar Torah. There are many people in his generation from the Jewish people that were leaving the Torah from based on what they were learning from Greek philosophy. And he feels as though this is an application of what it says in the Gemara in Chagiga. Gemara Chagiga tells a story about Rabbi Meir and his teacher. Who was his teacher? Elisha ben Avuya. Elisha ben Avuya, also known as Acher, the other one. Who's the other one? The other one was Elisha ben Avuya, who, based on his study of philosophy, it actually drove him crazy. It made him crazy. And so the rabbis at the time said that we need to put Elisha Baruya into Cherem. They actually outlawed interacting with him because he was so dangerous. And they actually gave him the nickname Acher, the other one. They didn't even call him by his name anymore. But his star pupil, Reb Meir, never left his side. So the Gemara Chagiga says, why is it that Reb Meir never left his side? Because Reb Meir was his faith was so strong that he was able to still learn from Acher the good things and then throw away all the bad things. Exactly what the Rambam was able to do with Aristotle, for example. So based on all this, what comes out is that, yes, the study of philosophy has the potential for being something that can that could add color to or create nuance to the way that we approach Torah thinking and the way that true Torah philosophy is supposed to be studied. There is no doubt that there are great ideas that were espoused by great philosophers of the secular world. But, and it's a big but, that one needs to be extremely careful, that one needs to go to the study of philosophy with only complete and strong faith that it cannot waver me in one way or another. So for a person like Rabbi Sachs, Rabbi Soloveitchik, for those individuals, yeah, no problem at all. For not only those individuals, Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz, for the Alter of Slobodka, Rabbi Saul Slanter. You don't think they studied? Of course, they also studied philosophy, but it was only as the Gra for sure studied philosophy. In fact, he writes that it's part of the Chazon Ish, 100% studied philosophy, but it was only after they were completely steeped in Torah as to see if there's anything else in the Chachmos HaOlam, anything else in the other wisdom of the world that is insightful, that is not against the Torah. But the only way to even know whether or not it's against the Torah or not is if you have a pure understanding of the Torah. So I would say like this, that today there's so much Torah to learn. There's so much Torah philosophy to learn that is written in the English language in our own native tongues that there's no excuse to start with any of the other secular philosophy. That if we go through Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Sachs, all of Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, all of these other works, and we still feel as though we are missing something, we still feel as though there is something that's not 100% there, so then maybe perhaps at that point there's something to be learned from the other philosophies. But as long as your faith cannot be wavered at all one way or another, like Rabbi Chanan Wasserman said, Kol haruchas ha'olam, all of the winds of the world could have been blowing, they would not have swayed the Rambam even 1 inch. It's very hard to say whether or not there's anyone today who can fit that bill. But the bottom line is that we need to approach the Torah with that same kind of curiosity that exists, as Revolva mentioned, that we mentioned in the beginning. As Revolva said, that they're asking questions in Athens and in Rome, where is God and how to live a successful, meaningful life? And we're all asking those questions. But the good thing is that we have the answer. The answer is by attaching ourselves to the Torah and to the Torah's philosophy first and foremost. And then only after that lifetime pursuit, let's see what else the world has to offer.
Philosophically, I know you're supposed to pay respect to king or respect to the country of your adopted country while we're in Galilee.
Yeah.
And by the same token, you can't separate yourself so much from your host country unless they separate you.
Right.
So it also makes sense that you would want to know a little bit about.
For sure. For sure. On a surface level understanding of these ideas is helpful even to understand Torah philosophy, because a lot of the time, just to help give further context, it's helpful to learn those topics. But the way that the philosophy is studied in universities is it's frankly a scary thing. That if a person, I've seen it with my own friends. I've seen friends of mine who did not have enough of a background in these areas, and they took philosophy courses, and it ruined them. It totally ruined them, because it's nonstop asking to the point that you turn from an agnostic to someone who has come to the conclusion that there is no answer to any of these questions, and then that's it, right? So that's the danger of going too far down that road. Yeah, is there anything wrong with just reading an article in Psychology Today? Probably not, but as long as you're a person that is steeped in their faith and is just trying to see, what else is out there, but with an understanding that if there is something puzzling to me, my first point of attention in order to deal with trying to find an answer to the question is a starting place of the Torah.
Our religion as well is we're asking questions all the time. A lot of it isn't based on logic. There's a lot we don't understand, and we do keep asking questions all the time, and a lot of it is just taking a leap of faith. So isn't that a very similar kind of situation?
For sure, but the right. Oh, I'm sorry, Marty, but I think you're right, and the issue is that for many people, the answer of a leap of faith is not sufficient enough at all. Frankly speaking, very often you'll hear even rabbis or teachers say that don't bother asking. We don't know. That also is wrong. That when someone says I don't know, the follow-up should be, so let's figure it out. Let's try and understand. And after a long, Shlomo Melech said, he gave testimony about himself that he spent his whole life trying to understand all of the mitzvahs of the Torah, and he was able to understand all of them except for one, which is the red heifer, the parah adumah. That was the one he couldn't understand. You know what that means? Is that if a person applies themselves, that there is a guidance for every single one of the mitzvahs on how to live life. There is wisdom in all of it. It's just a matter of spending your life trying to pursue to understand it. Yes, there are certain things that are beyond our comprehension. What the afterlife looks like, practically speaking, yes, is beyond our comprehension. But that there is an afterlife and coming to that conclusion is not beyond our comprehension. And it's not, I don't think we can say that it's just we just believe it because we were told it. I think that one can study it and come to that conclusion.
I remember when my kids, my son particularly, he's very kind of he doesn't trust, he's analytical. Well, he's